had some great questions come in, and feel free to send more. We have some time here to ask Brian about what democracy looked like. And I think the first question is kind of a pedagogical question, and I think it kind of gets at the difficulties of teaching about this era. And Kelly just asks, you know, how do we talk about, how do we talk to students? And I think diverse classrooms about this period, and we talk about how voting was restricted in all these different ways, first by property rights, in which was basically for white men. And then as different groups kind of found loopholes in that, as you've described really well, how these other sort of blanket, racial qualifications and other things came into be. So can you share a little bit about how, you might approach doing that?
Certainly.
Hard.
I think that I think as I started, I did want to I do want students to see that the debates of the past are in some ways still are debates. I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that the past and the present are the same. That's not true. Things have changed over time, but they don't go in a straight line toward in a progressive sort of way. And so I think that in this period, this period is illustrative of that, that we can acknowledge the revolutionary implications of elaborating, of creating an electorate that includes all white men. That is a kind of a way of understanding America as exceptional in global terms. But if we simply stop there, as many textbooks do, we miss democracy in action. We tend to think, well, therefore America was a democracy as a noun. But what I guess what I'm trying to argue in my remarks today, and what I'd hope that you'd be able to do with your students, is to show how people who were excluded from that electorate nevertheless thought that they ought to be part of it. And they didn't accept their exclusion passively. White defenders of this system often had to resort to violence, as I showed here, to keep the electorate exclusive, right? I mean, I think those lessons are illustrative. It's maybe not an ennobling narrative, a wholly positive one, but I think on the other hand that democracy is in the struggle.
Yeah. That's and
that can be illuminating to students who may feel like they don't have a lot of power, but there are a lot of ways to put pressure on systems, and I think that that's kind of what I'm hoping some of this evidence might do.
Yeah, no, I think it was great, and I love the way that you framed it, in that democracy can be, official actions that we think of, like say voting, but it can also be politics out of doors. It could be politics in the streets. It can be agitating. And so, as Jennifer just put in the chat, democracy as process. And I think it's kind of a neat thing for students to think about.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions that kind of get at the role of the states in all of this. And one from Grayson is about Southern state constitutions. And I don't know how much you know about this, but you know a lot. So do Southern state constitutions also limit voting to whites very explicitly, or is it just more implicit there? Or is this pretty much, as far as you know, most states do this?
Right. It's a good question. And there's not, again, like the rest of my talk, not a clear linear progression, right? In North Carolina, interestingly, in the early years of the early republic, free Black men who owned property could vote. That loophole was closed in a state convention early on in the 19th century, and North Carolina had another state convention in the middle of the 1850s, which got rid of property qualifications for voting for Senate, which so there was like a different, there was like no property qualification for voting for the lower house of the legislature, but one for the upper house. They got rid of that. Virginia had a freehold property qualification for voting until 1851. So there were a lot of disfranchised white men in Virginia up until the middle of the century. So again, it goes state by state. You know, the group of people who I didn't talk about at all are enslaved people. And I think that, you know, the Republican basis very clearly, you know, operates in the South, maybe most clearly of all, is that these dependent people surely could not vote for the reasons you know, that I already stated.
Yeah.
So, you know, in some ways, they Southern legislatures don't have to talk about race and citizenship in the same way, because most there certainly are pockets of free people of color in the South, but they're not numerous enough as they are in some northern states to really create this discussion.
And I think that's why, like a lot of historians have pointed out, that kind of the idea of segregation and Jim Crow laws, a lot of that framework actually comes from the North, because as you just said, it's Northern, you know, politics and state legislatures that are pushed to pass those kinds of laws.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I will say that in a state like Pennsylvania, you would think like, well, surely Black men must have gotten the right to vote before the Civil War. No, they didn't. It was the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave Black men the right to vote, which gave African American men the right to vote in Pennsylvania, as it did in the conquered South.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah,
yeah, and so Todd asked a really good question. Just thinking about the interplay of national politics and state affairs, and why would state conventions sort of bend to national political pressure?
Yeah, I think the answer is the nature of the party system as it unfold. The second party system, the Whigs versus the Democrats in the 1830s and 40s. Both of these political parties were national political parties, and so both parties had to make the northern members of these parties had to make peace with slavery in order to keep those party coalitions together. The Democrats tended to cave to Southern counterparts on slavery a bit more than Whigs did, and that's why the Whig Party coalition broke down first in the early 50s. And in fact, Northern Democrats who went along with this plan to take voting rights away from Black Pennsylvanians were called dough faces by their political opponents, as if their faces were made of dough and they could be beat very easily into the shape that the slave power wanted them to take. So I think it's a reflection of the nature of the party system. Until the Republican Party of the mid-50s, the 1850s, you don't have a sectional political party. You have national political coalitions that try to tamp down conflict about slavery because they're worried about their party's ability to win elections.
Yeah, that's a great answer. An issue that I think we've wrestled with all week is kind of counterintuitive, because I think the idea that, you know, property requirements were required for voting, you know, kind of is offensive to our sensibilities today in the 21st century. You know, any kind of barrier like that, and yet, as we've seen, and I think you told really well, this was the way that marginalized groups, you know, that women, you know, in the case of New Jersey and,
right,
and African Americans, you know, the only way they were allowed to vote was, you know, under this system when they had, you know, enough property. And
right.
I wonder, do you want to say a little bit more about that and and how that might kind of connect to how we think about voting today and the big switch.
Yeah. As in my example about Rhode Island, where
Yeah.
African-American men get the right to vote by defending the opponents of a wider electorate. I think that we just have to grapple with the ways in which our historical subjects try to navigate the regulations of the system as it existed, as well as trying to change that system, right? And at the time, the debate is about, it does kind of tend to go back to that Republican notion of the common good, right? That citizens should not be motivated by self-interest, but should promote the commonwealth and sacrifice for it. And a great many people decide that the best way to realize their self-interest is by saying, I have virtuously sacrificed, right? And so indeed, property holding as a requirement for voting, I start with that with my students and say, who amongst you, are renters, who amongst you has a wage paying job?
They don't
as a way to rile them up,
Yeah.
get them angry. It's like, yeah, you guys would not be among the electorate. And they're like, what? But I think that certainly that kind of impulse of trying to navigate within a system to exploit its deficiencies versus overthrowing the system. Both of those impulses are there, but historical actors, we today have to decide, which we think are, the best way to live our lives, to attain our goals. I think that's a challenge for us, but certainly I think we can understand that people operating under a different system with these particular rules might have interfaced with it.
Yeah, you described that so well. With my students, when we look at primary documents and we look at a really significant day where you want to go into the record and you want the historical subjects to say something profound, right? and really, there's a lot of connection between humanity across the ages, and
Yeah.
and most humans in any given day are just trying to get through the day.
Right.
They're trying to do the best they can,
Yeah, and a lot of people, I would also say, like John Adams, are motivated by fear, right? When he says there's not going to be any end to this, you're not going to be able to stop this. It's like, a slippery slope sort of argument. There are people with a lot of power who are trying to slow the wheels of progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I say this sometimes, and it sounds kind of blasphemous from a historian, especially of the founding era, but I think sometimes the founders have too much influence on our politics, that there's a lot of things we should emulate and admire about them, but some of these ideas just don't belong in our 21st century society, right?
No.
Yeah. Well, this is terrific. I think we've all earned a break, and you've given us a lot to think about.